My boyfriend was secretly destroying my business from the inside. I destroyed something bigger. I started my catering company 2 years ago with $5,000 I'd saved working doubles at restaurants. Started small, just doing kids' parties and small office lunches, but I was good at it, and word spread. Within 6 months, I had regular clients and was booking weddings. My boyfriend Luke was supportive from day one, helping me carry equipment, taste testing recipes, even designing my business cards. He worked in IT and would always say how proud he was that I was building something real while he just fixed computers all day. By year 2, I had 3 part-time employees and was turning profit every month. That's when weird things started happening. First, it was small stuff. I'd confirm an event time with a client, then they'd call angry saying I was late. They'd show me texts from my business number changing the time. I never sent those texts. I started screenshotting everything, but it kept happening. Then ingredients started going missing. I'd inventory everything the night before an event, come in early, and half my prep would be gone. Thousands of dollars of food just vanished. No signs of break-in, nothing on cameras. I thought I was going crazy. Luke would help me search and comfort me when I cried from stress. The health department showed up 3 times in 1 month saying they'd received complaints. They never found anything wrong, but just having them there scared customers. My Yelp started getting 1-star reviews from people I'd never catered for, talking about food poisoning and roaches. Every time I'd get them removed, new ones would appear. Luke would hold me while I panicked about losing everything I'd built. He'd tell me maybe it was a competitor. Maybe I should scale back until things calmed down. The breaking point was the Henderson wedding. 200-person event, my biggest ever, $20,000 contract. The morning of, my van wouldn't start. My backup van wouldn't start. Luke offered to drive me in his car but said we could only fit half the food. I had to call the bride 2 hours before her wedding and cancel. She threatened to destroy me, and she did. Word spread that I was unreliable. Bookings dried up. I had to let my employees go. Luke suggested maybe I should take a break, work for someone else for a while, get my confidence back. That night, I was crying in bed when Luke's phone buzzed. He was in the shower. I never looked at his phone, but something made me check. It was his friend asking if the wedding thing worked and if I was finally giving up on the stupid food thing. I scrolled up. Everything was there. Luke had been changing times through a spoofing app he built. He'd been coming back at night with his spare key and throwing out my ingredients. He'd made the health complaints from burner phones. He'd hired people on TaskRabbit to write fake reviews. His friend asked why he was doing it, and Luke said he was tired of me working weekends, tired of me talking about the business instead of him, tired of playing second to food. He said once I failed, I'd have to get a normal job, and they could be a normal couple. I sat there numb. This man had smiled at me, comforted me, held me while I cried about problems he created. I wanted to scream, but instead I planned. First, I acted defeated. Told Luke he was right, I should give up. Started applying to restaurant jobs. He was so happy, kept talking about how we'd have evenings together now, could take vacations, be normal. Meanwhile, I was documenting everything. Not for court, for something better. Luke had one thing he loved more than anything, his classic car. A 1969 Mustang he'd restored with his dad before his dad died. He spent every Sunday working on it, showed it at every car meet, had professional photos of it on his desk. It was worth $40,000, but to Luke, it was priceless. 2 weeks after I discovered everything, Luke went to a tech conference for 3 days. The first night, I posted his car for sale. Not on normal sites where his friends might see. On specialty forums for overseas collectors. Listed it for $15,000, cash only, urgent sale due to family emergency. The calls started immediately. I picked a buyer from 2 states away who could come immediately with cash. Sold it in Luke's driveway at midnight. Gave them the title he kept in his filing cabinet, the spare keys, everything. They drove away with his baby. But I wasn't done. I took the $15,000 and used it to restart my catering. Rented a commercial kitchen across town, hired back my employees, reached out to old clients with apologies and discounts. Luke came home to an empty driveway. He called the police, but I showed them the security footage of me willingly handing over keys and signing papers. I told them Luke knew I was selling it for business money. We lived together, shared expenses. Why would he be surprised? The police said it was a domestic issue and left. Luke lost his mind. He came through the door screaming. I was sitting on the couch with my laptop, looking at kitchen rental listings, when he burst in and saw the empty driveway through the window. His face went red, then purple. He called me every name I'd ever heard and some I hadn't. Thief, psycho, vindictive bitch. He paced back and forth, spit flying as he yelled about having me arrested, about how I'd stolen his property, about how I'd destroyed the only thing that mattered to him. I stayed calm. I'd practiced this. I told him we were a couple who shared everything, that we'd talked about me needing money to restart the business, that he'd been so supportive of my career. He screamed that he never agreed to sell the car. I reminded him how he'd held me while I cried, how he'd suggested he grabbed his phone and called 911. I let him. I had the security footage ready on my laptop, the signed title, the cash deposit receipt. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, Luke was still raging. The officers looked tired. They asked what happened. Luke said I stole his car and sold it without permission. I showed them the footage of me handing over the keys and signing the title in the driveway. I explained that Luke and I lived together, shared all our expenses, and I'd sold our car to get money for my catering business like he'd been encouraging me to do. The officers looked at each other. One of them asked Luke if we lived together. Luke said yes, but that didn't matter. The officer said it was a civil matter between domestic partners and they couldn't arrest me for selling shared property. Luke's face went from purple to almost white. He started yelling at the officers about how the car was his dad restored it was priceless. The officers said he'd need to take it up in civil court and left. Luke stood in the middle of our living room shaking. Then he turned on me again, and this time his voice was low and cold. He said I had no idea what I'd done. He said he'd make me pay for this. He said he'd destroy me the way I destroyed him. I just looked at him and realized I didn't know this person at all. The next morning, I waited until Luke left for work. He slammed the door so hard the frame cracked. I gave it 10 minutes to make sure he didn't come back. Then I started packing. I took only my clothes, my laptop, my cooking equipment that I'd bought before we met. I left the furniture we'd picked out together, the dishes, the decorations. I took photos of everything I was leaving behind with my phone, time-stamped and dated. I knew he'd claim I stole things if I took anything we'd purchased together. I filled 2 suitcases and 3 boxes. My best friend Celia lived across town in a 2-bedroom apartment. I called her from the car. She said to come over immediately. When I got there, she helped me carry everything up to her spare room. She didn't ask many questions, just hugged me and said I could stay as long as I needed. I sat on the bed in her spare room and felt my phone start buzzing. Luke had gotten home early. The texts started coming in waves. First angry ones calling me a coward for leaving while he was gone. Then desperate ones begging me to come back so we could talk. Then threatening ones about lawyers and lawsuits. I screenshotted every single one and uploaded them to a cloud drive I'd created just for this. Then I blocked his number. The silence felt strange. For 2 years, I'd checked my phone constantly, worried about his texts, his needs, his feelings. Now there was nothing. Celia knocked on the door and asked if I wanted dinner. I said yes. My phone rang 2 days later from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Rachel, one of my former employees. Her voice was shaky. She said Luke had shown up at her apartment the night before, banging on her door at 10 p.m. She'd looked through the peephole and seen him pacing in the hallway. When she opened the door with the chain still on, he'd asked where I was. She said she didn't know. He'd started talking fast, telling her I was having some kind of breakdown, that I'd stolen his car and run away, that he was worried about my mental state. Rachel said she'd told him to leave or she'd call the police. He'd finally left but sat in his car outside her building for an hour. She'd watched him from her window. She wanted me to know what he was doing. Then she asked if I was really restarting the business. I told her yes. She said she never trusted Luke, that something about him always felt off. She asked if I needed help. I told her I'd call her once I had the new kitchen space secured. Stuart Lutz ran a commercial kitchen on the east side of town. I'd met him at a food industry meetup 2 years ago. His space was bigger than I needed, but he rented it by the hour to multiple small businesses. I drove over on a Thursday afternoon. The kitchen was clean and well-equipped with 6 burner stoves, 3 ovens, and huge prep tables. Stuart was probably 60, with gray hair and kind eyes. He asked what brought me back to catering after my hiatus. I told him I'd had some personal setbacks but was ready to start fresh. He didn't push for details. He offered me a rate that was lower than I expected and said I could have flexible scheduling since I was building from scratch. He said he liked helping small businesses get started. We shook hands. I signed a month-to-month agreement. I had my kitchen back. The fake social media account appeared 3 days later. It was a burner profile with no photo and a generic name. The message came through on every platform I had. It said I'd destroyed something that could never be replaced. It said Luke's dad had put his heart into that car and I'd thrown it away like garbage. It said everyone would know what kind of person I really was. It said I'd regret what I'd done. I screenshotted it all and added it to my cloud drive. I didn't respond. 2 more messages came over the next day, each one angrier than the last. I reported the account and blocked it. Another one appeared the next day. I blocked that one too. I wondered how long he'd keep this up. A mutual friend named Sarah called me the following week. She said someone named Morgan Davis wanted to talk to me. The name sounded familiar. I asked who he was. Sarah said he was Luke's best friend. I remembered the texts on Luke's phone. Morgan was the one who'd asked if the wedding sabotage worked. I told Sarah I didn't want to talk to any of Luke's friends. She said Morgan had specifically asked her to tell me he needed to explain something, that it was important. I didn't trust it, but I was curious. I told Sarah I'd meet him in a public place with Celia there. We agreed on a coffee shop downtown on Saturday afternoon. Morgan was already there when Celia and I arrived. He was tall and thin, wearing a button-down shirt and glasses. He looked nervous. He stood up when he saw us and asked if I was me. I said yes. Celia sat down next to me and crossed her arms. Morgan sat back down and started talking immediately. He said he had no idea Luke was sabotaging my business. I asked about the texts. He said he thought Luke was joking, that Luke had a dark sense of humor, and he'd assumed the wedding thing was just Luke venting about being frustrated. He said he'd known Luke since college and had never seen this side of him. He looked genuinely shaken. His hands were shaking when he picked up his coffee cup. I asked why he wanted to meet. He said he needed me to know he wasn't part of it. I asked if he believed me about what Luke did. He said yes. He said after I sold the car, Luke had called him crying and told him everything. Morgan said hearing Luke describe what he'd done made him sick. Morgan set down his coffee and leaned forward. He said Luke had been calling him constantly for the past 2 weeks. Sometimes Luke would be sobbing about losing his dad's car and how it was the only thing he had left of his father. Other times, Luke would be ranting about making me pay, about suing me for everything, about destroying my reputation the way I destroyed his most precious possession. Morgan said he'd tried to tell Luke that what he did to my business was worse, that he'd sabotaged my livelihood for months. Luke had hung up on him. Morgan said he was warning me because Luke was talking about suing me for the car's full value plus emotional distress. He said Luke had already contacted a lawyer. I thanked him for the information. He asked if I was going to be okay. I said I would be. Celia and I left. In the car, Celia said Morgan seemed genuinely sorry. I said maybe, but sorry didn't undo what Luke had done. I had a business to rebuild and apparently a lawsuit to prepare for. I found a lawyer through Celia's cousin who specialized in domestic disputes. Her office was in a converted house downtown with creaky floors and plants everywhere. She listened to my whole story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and tapped her pen against the desk. She explained that Luke and I living together complicated everything. We shared expenses, split rent, had joint accounts for utilities. The car title was in Luke's name only, but proving I acted with bad intent would be hard for him. He'd have to show I knew I didn't have the right to sell it. My story about needing business money and us being partners made sense to the police already. She said he could sue me in civil court, but it would cost him thousands in legal fees with no guarantee he'd win. I asked what would happen if he did sue. She said it could take years and cost both of us more than the car was worth. Then she asked if I had anything that might convince him to back off. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshots. Luke's texts about the wedding sabotage, the fake review schemes, the spoofing app conversations. She scrolled through everything slowly, her expression getting more serious. She looked up and said this evidence could destroy him if it went public. His career in IT would be over if people knew he used his skills to sabotage someone's business. But she warned me that using it might make things worse. Luke could get desperate if he felt cornered. I thanked her and paid for the consultation with money I didn't really have. The next day, I started reaching out to old clients. I sent personal emails, not mass messages. I apologized for the equipment failures and explained I'd moved to a better facility with backup systems. I offered 30% discounts for anyone willing to give me another shot. Most didn't respond. A few sent polite rejections saying they'd moved on to other caterers. But 2 days later, a woman named Janine Chen replied. She remembered me from her daughter's 8th birthday party last year. The unicorn cake I'd made was still the talk of her daughter's friend group. She said she'd heard about the Henderson wedding disaster, but everyone has bad days. She was planning her company's holiday party and wanted to book me. The event was for 60 people at her office in December. She said if I did well, her company used the same caterer every year for multiple events. I nearly cried reading her email. I wrote back immediately confirming the date and promising her the best food her company had ever had. 3 days after that, everything got worse. It was almost midnight when Celia's phone rang. I was on her couch watching TV while she was in bed. I heard her boyfriend answer, his voice getting louder. Then Celia came out in her pajamas looking scared. Someone was banging on their front door. I looked through the peephole and saw Luke. His face was red and he was hitting the door with his palm. He was yelling my name, demanding I come out and talk to him. Celia's boyfriend came to the door and yelled through it that he was calling the police. Luke kept banging and screaming about his car, about how I was a thief and a liar. Neighbors' lights started coming on. Celia's boyfriend opened the door with the chain still on and told Luke to leave or he'd call the cops. Luke finally stopped banging, but he didn't leave. He walked to his car and just sat there. We watched him through the window for 2 hours. He just sat in his car staring at Celia's building. Finally, around 2 in the morning, he drove away. I couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went straight to the courthouse. I filled out the paperwork for a restraining order and attached printed screenshots of Luke's threatening messages, the fake social media accounts, and photos Celia's boyfriend took of Luke sitting outside their building. The clerk processed everything and sent me to a judge. The judge read through my evidence quickly and granted a temporary order right there. Luke had to stay at least 500 feet away from me, Celia, and my workplace. The order would be in effect immediately, and a hearing would be scheduled to make it permanent. I left the courthouse feeling safer, but also knowing this would make Luke even angrier. 3 days later, I was at Stuart's kitchen prepping for a small office lunch. I had my headphones in and was chopping vegetables when Stuart came running over. He pulled my headphones off and said Luke was outside. I looked through the window and saw Luke's car in the parking lot. He was walking toward the building. Stuart already had his phone out calling the police. Luke came through the door and started yelling about the restraining order being bullshit, about me ruining his life over nothing. Stuart stepped between us and told Luke to leave. Luke tried to push past him, but Stuart was bigger. The police arrived within 5 minutes. They arrested Luke right there in the kitchen. He was screaming about his car the whole time they put him in the cruiser. Stuart told the officers about the restraining order, and they said Luke would be released later that day with a warning, but another violation would mean jail time. After they left, Stuart made me sit down and drink water. My hands were shaking, so hard I could barely hold the glass. That night, I got a Facebook message from someone named Jerome Rankin. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. His message was polite and said he was Luke's uncle, the one who'd helped restore the Mustang with Luke and his dad. He said Luke had been calling him constantly with a story that didn't make sense. He asked if I'd be willing to meet and talk about what really happened. He promised he just wanted to understand, not to attack me or defend Luke. Something about the message felt genuine. I checked his profile and saw photos of him with an older version of Luke's face. Family photos going back years. I wrote back and agreed to meet at a public diner the next day. Jerome was already in a booth when I arrived. He was maybe 60 with gray hair and kind eyes. He stood up when he saw me and shook my hand. We ordered coffee and he got straight to it. He said Luke told him I'd stolen his car out of spite after a fight. But Luke's story kept changing and didn't add up. Jerome had known me from family dinners Luke brought me to. He said I'd never seemed spiteful or crazy. I took a breath and told him everything. The sabotage, the texts I found, the months of Luke destroying my business while pretending to comfort me. I showed him the screenshots on my phone. Jerome read through them slowly, his jaw getting tighter. When he finished, he set my phone down and stared at his coffee for a long time. Finally, he said he believed me. He said his brother, Luke's dad, would be ashamed of what Luke had become. Jerome's voice got rough when he talked about his brother. He said Luke's dad was the most honest man he'd ever known. He taught Luke about integrity and hard work while they restored that Mustang together. Every bolt they turned, Luke's dad talked about doing things right even when no one was watching. Jerome said Luke had dishonored everything his father taught him. He looked at me and said he wouldn't help Luke sue me. If it came to court, he'd testify about Luke's character and what he'd seen in those texts. He said his brother would want the truth told, not his son protected from consequences. We sat there for another hour while Jerome asked questions about the business and what I was doing now. When we left, he hugged me and told me to call him if Luke caused more problems. He said family wasn't about blood. It was about doing right by people. I left the diner feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Jerome's support meant something, knowing that even Luke's own family saw through his lies. But the relief lasted exactly 2 days. That's when the certified letter arrived at Celia's address. I stood in her kitchen holding the thick envelope, my hands shaking as I read the law firm's name embossed across the top. Luke's lawyer was demanding $50,000. $50,000. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The letter broke it down in cold legal language. $25,000 for the car's actual value, $15,000 for emotional distress, $10,000 for loss of irreplaceable property with sentimental significance. They cited pain and suffering, intentional infliction of emotional distress, conversion of property. The words blurred together as I read. My lawyer called me in that afternoon after I forwarded her the demand letter. She sat across from me in her small office and went through it line by line. Luke's lawyer was throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck. The emotional distress claim was weak, she said, but the property conversion had some teeth since we weren't married, and the car was solely in his name. I showed her the screenshots again, all the evidence of Luke's sabotage. She leaned back in her chair and asked if I wanted to go nuclear. We could respond with our own letter detailing every crime Luke committed. The spoofing app was illegal wiretapping. Destroying my ingredients was theft and vandalism. The fake health complaints were filing false reports. We could threaten criminal charges and make this very ugly for him. I told her to do it. She drafted a response that made Luke's demand letter look gentle. She laid out each instance of sabotage with dates and evidence. She cited specific criminal statutes he'd violated. She suggested that if Luke wanted to involve the courts, we'd be happy to provide all this documentation to the district attorney's office. The letter ended with a recommendation that Luke drop all claims immediately or face potential prosecution. She sent it certified mail the next day. For a week, nothing happened. Then Luke's lawyer responded with an even angrier letter claiming we were making false accusations and attempting extortion. My lawyer fired back. His lawyer escalated. The letters got more aggressive with each exchange, legal threats flying back and forth like grenades. 2 weeks of this back and forth drained me more than the actual events had. Every day I checked the mail expecting another attack. My lawyer finally called and suggested mediation, and she said we could keep throwing letters at each other for months, racking up legal fees neither of us could afford, or we could sit down with a neutral third party and try to settle this. She warned me that actual court would cost more than any settlement and drag on for over a year. The emotional toll alone might not be worth it. I agreed to mediation, but I hated that Luke was forcing me into this position. While the legal nightmare continued, I focused on rebuilding the business. Stuart gave me flexible hours in his commercial kitchen and didn't ask questions when I showed up at odd times to avoid running into other renters. I started small, reaching out to former clients with personal emails apologizing for the Henderson disaster and explaining I'd had equipment failures but everything was resolved now. I offered steep discounts, sometimes barely breaking even, just to get back in front of people. A woman named Janine Chen responded first. I'd catered her daughter's 8th birthday party the year before, one of those elaborate princess-themed events with custom cookies shaped like crowns. She said her company was planning a small retirement lunch for 20 people and asked if I was available. The budget was tight, but I took it. I spent 2 days prepping, triple-checking every ingredient, every measurement, every timeline. The lunch went perfectly. Janine sent me a glowing email the next day saying everyone loved the food and asking for my card to pass around the office. 2 more clients reached out after that, both referrals from satisfied customers before everything fell apart. The bookings were small, nothing like the weddings I used to do, but they were real work, real income. Rachel called me out of nowhere on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd heard through mutual friends that I was working again and asked if I needed help. I told her I could only afford part-time hours and the pay wasn't great yet. She said she didn't care, she believed in what I was building and wanted to be part of it. I hired her back that week. Then I brought on another part-timer, a culinary school student named Miko who needed experience and was willing to work for minimum wage plus meals. We were a tiny operation, but we were functional. That's when Luke struck again. I got an alert on my phone from Yelp about a new review. 1 star. The review claimed I'd catered an office party the previous week where half the guests got food poisoning from spoiled chicken. It described symptoms in graphic detail and said the company was considering legal action. I'd never catered any office party the previous week. My hands went cold as I read it. Luke was still sabotaging me even with a restraining order in place. I immediately reported the review to Yelp with a detailed explanation. I attached a copy of the restraining order and screenshots showing I had no events that matched the review's description. I included my business calendar proving I couldn't have done the catering mentioned. Yelp's response came within hours. They removed the review and sent me a message saying they'd flagged the IP address for suspicious activity. If any more fake reviews appeared from related accounts, they'd take additional action. I felt a small win, but also a deep exhaustion. Luke couldn't let this go. The next battle came when I needed to get the rest of my belongings from our apartment. I'd been putting it off, living out of the 2 suitcases I'd grabbed that first day at Celia's place. But I needed my kitchen equipment, my recipe binders, my clothes. The police escort met me at the apartment on a Thursday morning. 2 officers stood in the hallway while I used my key to open the door. Luke wasn't there, but his presence haunted every room. I walked into the bedroom and stopped. My side of the closet was destroyed. Clothes ripped off hangers and thrown on the floor. My photos were torn in half and scattered across the dresser. In the corner, I found my grandmother's quilt, the one she'd made by hand over 6 months before she died. Luke had cut it into pieces with scissors. Deliberate, clean cuts through fabric that represented hours of my grandmother's love and work. I stood there holding scraps of the quilt, and something broke inside me. The officer asked if I was okay. I wasn't. I packed everything salvageable into boxes while trying not to look at the destruction. My kitchen equipment was still intact in the storage closet, probably because Luke didn't know which tools were mine versus his. I loaded everything into Celia's car with the officers helping carry boxes. As I was leaving, the landlord appeared in the hallway. He asked if I had a minute to talk. We stood outside while he explained that Luke hadn't paid rent in 2 months. He wanted to know if I was still on the lease because he needed someone to cover the missing payments, or he'd have to start eviction proceedings. I showed him the restraining order and explained we'd separated. I told him I'd moved out and wasn't coming back. He looked relieved and said he'd remove me from the lease immediately. Luke would be responsible for the full rent going forward or face eviction. I signed the papers he'd brought and walked away from that apartment forever. 3 weeks later, Morgan texted me. Luke had been evicted and moved into Morgan's spare room temporarily. The text was apologetic, explaining that Morgan felt obligated to help because they'd been friends since college. But he wanted me to know Luke was in bad shape. Luke barely ate, barely slept, spent all his time online searching for his Mustang. Morgan said Luke had contacted every classic car forum and collector group trying to track down the buyer. He'd even hired a private investigator, but the trail went cold at the state border. Luke was spiraling and Morgan didn't know how to help him. I read the text and felt nothing. No sympathy, no guilt, no satisfaction. Just emptiness where Luke used to occupy space in my mind. I spent the next week preparing for the wedding like it was the most important event of my life. Rachel helped me triple-check every detail, from ingredient counts to backup equipment. The morning of the event, I arrived 3 hours early and set up in the venue's kitchen. Everything went exactly as planned. The appetizers came out perfectly timed. The main course earned compliments from the bride's family, and the dessert display looked like something from a magazine. The bride found me during cleanup and hugged me, so hard I thought my ribs would crack. She pulled out her phone right there and posted photos of the food on Instagram, tagging my business and writing about how I'd saved her wedding. Before I left, 7 different guests stopped me to ask for business cards. I drove back to Stuart's kitchen feeling something I hadn't felt in months, like maybe I could actually rebuild this. 3 days later, my lawyer called. Luke's lawyer wanted to set up mediation instead of going to court. She explained that a neutral third party would help us settle everything, the car situation, shared property from the apartment, and making the restraining orders permanent. Court would cost thousands in legal fees and could drag on for months. Mediation would cost a fraction of that and we could be done in 1 session. I hated the idea of sitting in a room with Luke, but I was tired of spending money on lawyers when I needed every dollar for the business. I told her to set it up. The mediation happened 2 weeks later in a bland office building downtown. I arrived early with my lawyer and sat in the waiting area watching the door. When Luke walked in with his lawyer, I barely recognized him. He'd lost weight. His clothes hung loose on his frame and dark circles made his eyes look sunken. His hair was greasy like he hadn't showered in days. He saw me and his whole body went rigid. The hatred in his eyes was so intense I had to look away, but underneath it I saw something else that might have been regret or just exhaustion. The mediator was a woman in her 50s who introduced herself and explained the process. We'd each present our side without interruption, then work toward a settlement both parties could accept. Luke's lawyer went first and spent 20 minutes talking about the Mustang's value, both monetary and sentimental. He showed photos of Luke and his dad working on the car, the restoration process, car show awards. He painted me as vindictive and cruel for taking the one thing Luke treasured most. Then my lawyer stood up. She pulled out her laptop and showed the mediator screenshots of Luke's texts about sabotaging my business. She had the fake Yelp reviews, evidence of the spoofing app, records of the health department complaints from burner phones. Luke's lawyer's face went pale as he saw it all. He kept glancing at Luke with this look of shock and anger, like he was realizing his client had lied to him. Luke started crying halfway through my lawyer's presentation. Not quiet tears, but loud sobs that shook his shoulders. The mediator asked if he needed a break, but he shook his head. When my lawyer finished, the mediator asked Luke directly if the evidence was accurate. Luke nodded and said yes, he'd done all of it. His voice came out broken and hoarse. He said he felt neglected because I worked all the time and he wanted me to need him again like I did at the beginning. He thought if the business failed, we'd go back to being normal and happy. The mediator asked him if he understood that sabotaging someone's livelihood was abusive behavior. Luke just cried harder and didn't answer. We spent 4 hours negotiating. Luke's lawyer kept pushing for the full $40,000 the car was worth, but my lawyer countered with the sabotage damages and threatened criminal charges. Eventually, we reached a number, $12,000 for the car. Luke would drop all other claims about shared property and the apartment. We'd both agree to permanent restraining orders that meant we could never contact each other again. I wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that $12,000 was nothing compared to what he'd destroyed. But I was so tired of fighting, and my lawyer kept saying this was the best outcome we'd get. I signed the papers and walked out without looking at Luke again. The $12,000 meant taking out a small business loan since I'd already spent the $15,000 from selling the car. The loan payments would eat into my profits for the next 2 years, setting back any plans to expand or hire more staff. My lawyer assured me it was still better than months of court battles that could cost even more with no guarantee I'd win. I signed the loan papers and wrote Luke a check, officially ending our legal connection. Celia helped me apartment hunt the following week. Most places in my budget were sketchy or too far from Stuart's kitchen. We finally found a studio in an older building that was small but clean. The landlord didn't care about my recent eviction since I had first and last month's rent in cash. I bought new locks the same day I moved in and installed a security system that sent alerts to my phone. The apartment was basically one room with a tiny bathroom and a kitchen the size of a closet, but it was mine. Nobody else had keys, nobody could get in without my permission, and I could finally sleep without jumping at every sound. Morgan texted me a month after mediation. Luke had moved to another city for a job in tech support. Morgan said Luke wanted a fresh start somewhere nobody knew what happened. The text ended with another apology for not seeing what Luke was doing, and an offer to be a reference if any of my clients wanted to verify my character. I thanked him and saved the message in case I needed it, but mostly I felt relief that Luke was gone and wouldn't be showing up places anymore. I spent the next 2 months working every single day. Small parties, corporate lunches, baby showers, anything I could book. Rachel came back full-time and I hired another prep cook to help with the increased workload. Every event got my absolute best effort. Every client got follow-up calls to make sure they were satisfied. The positive reviews started accumulating on my business page. Slowly, the fake 1-star reviews Luke had planted got buried under real feedback from real clients. My booking calendar filled up 3 months out, then 4. I started getting referrals from Delilah again, the wedding planner who'd given me a chance after everything fell apart. People were starting to trust me again, and it felt like I could finally breathe. Rachel called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was prepping for a small office party. She sounded excited in that way people get when they have gossip they know will matter. She'd run into someone from Luke's old IT company at the grocery store, one of the guys from his team who recognized her from the company picnic Luke dragged me to once. The guy told Rachel that Luke got fired about a month ago. Not laid off, fired. The company found the spoofing software on his work computer during a routine security check. They dug deeper and discovered he'd been using company resources and time to build apps for personal use, specifically apps designed to harass someone. Rachel said the guy didn't know it was me Luke had targeted, just that management fired him immediately and walked him out with security. She asked if I wanted his name in case I needed it for anything legal, but I told her the legal stuff was over. I just felt this weird sense of relief knowing Luke's sabotage had caught up to him in ways I never planned. He destroyed his own career trying to destroy mine. Jerome reached out a few days later through Facebook Messenger. His message was short but thoughtful, saying he'd been talking to family members about what really happened between Luke and me. He wanted me to know that several relatives, people who'd been cold to me at family gatherings, or who Luke had probably fed lies to, wanted to apologize. Jerome said Luke's cousin felt terrible for believing Luke's version where I was the unstable one who stole his car out of spite. His aunt wanted to send me a card. I read the message twice before responding. I told Jerome I appreciated him being honest with everyone, but they didn't need to apologize to me. They believed someone they loved and trusted, which made sense. I thanked him for standing up for the truth and said that meant more than any apology from people who barely knew me. He sent back a simple thumbs up and a message saying his brother would have wanted him to do the right thing. Delilah called me that same week about a wedding consultation. When I arrived at her office, she had 3 folders on her desk, each one a different wedding happening over the next 4 months. She slid them across to me and said she only worked with vendors she trusted completely, and after watching me rebuild my reputation through consistent, excellent work, she wanted me as her preferred caterer. I felt something tight in my chest loosen as I flipped through the details. 2 of the weddings were medium-sized, around 100 guests each. The third was smaller, but at a fancy venue that usually brought in high-end clients. Delilah leaned back in her chair and admitted something that surprised me. She said during the Henderson disaster, she suspected something was wrong because it was so unlike my usual work. My prep was always organized, my timing always perfect, my communication always clear. When everything fell apart that day, it felt off to her. But she didn't have proof of anything, so she stayed quiet. She felt guilty about that. I told her there was nothing she could have done, and I was just grateful she was giving me another chance now. We shook hands on all 3 weddings. The new bookings meant I needed more help. I put out a call for part-time staff and interviewed 5 people over 2 days. I hired 2 of them. The first was a woman in her 50s who had catering experience and needed flexible hours around her other job. The second was a culinary school graduate, fresh out of a program in the city, who brought energy and new ideas I hadn't considered. She suggested updating my menu with some modern fusion options that would appeal to younger clients. We spent an afternoon developing 3 new dishes, testing flavors and presentation until we had something I felt confident offering. I also finally invested in professional photos of my food. A photographer who'd done some events for me agreed to do a full menu shoot at a discounted rate. The new photos went up on my website the same day, and I updated all my social media with the fresh content. The business started to look polished and professional in ways it hadn't before. My phone rang on a Saturday morning from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was hesitant, apologetic. It was Mrs. Henderson, the bride whose wedding I'd missed. She said Delilah had told her what really happened, about Luke sabotaging my business, about the vans being tampered with. She apologized for threatening to destroy me when I was already being destroyed by someone I trusted. Her voice cracked a little when she said she understood now that I hadn't been unreliable or unprofessional. I'd been a victim. She asked if I would consider catering her sister's wedding as a second chance. The wedding was in 3 months, 150 guests, at a nice venue outside the city. I told her I would need to think about it, not because I didn't want the job, but because I needed to make sure I could handle it without the fear of sabotage hanging over me. She understood and said to take my time. I spent 2 days planning before I called Mrs. Henderson back. I accepted the job, but with conditions. I wanted backup vendors on standby for key ingredients in case anything went wrong. I wanted my own security cameras in my prep space. I wanted detailed contracts with the venue about access and storage. Mrs. Henderson agreed to everything without hesitation. She said her sister was excited to work with me and had heard great things about my food from other clients. The planning process took weeks. I created backup plans for every possible scenario. My new employees helped me prep components ahead of time and freeze them properly. I rented a second vehicle as backup transportation. I checked and double-checked every detail until I was confident nothing could go wrong. The wedding day arrived and everything ran perfectly. The food came out hot and beautiful. Guests complimented every course. Mrs. Henderson herself, the original bride who'd threatened to ruin me, told 3 different groups of guests that I was the best caterer in the city, and they should book me immediately. I watched her sister's face during the reception, saw how happy she was, and felt something settle in me that had been tense for over a year. 6 months had passed since I sold the Mustang. I sat in my tiny studio apartment one evening and looked at my business accounts on my laptop. My booking calendar was full for the next 5 months. I had a waiting list for premium weekend dates. The loan I'd taken to pay Luke's settlement was paid off completely. I'd even started building savings again, putting away money each week into an account Luke never knew about and never could access. The business was more successful than it had been before everything fell apart. I had steady employees, reliable clients, and a reputation I'd rebuilt through hard work and consistency. The fake reviews Luke planted were buried under dozens of real 5-star reviews. My social media following had grown. People tagged me in posts about their events. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of my apartment, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. But I also knew I wasn't okay. The betrayal sat in me like something heavy I carried around every day. I made an appointment with a therapist that week. The first session was hard. I cried through most of it, telling the story of Luke's sabotage, the way he'd comforted me while destroying me, the way I'd trusted him completely. The therapist listened and then asked me questions I hadn't considered. Had Luke shown controlling behavior before the sabotage? Had there been other red flags I'd ignored? I started remembering small things. The way Luke always wanted to know where I was, the way he'd get quiet and distant when I talked about business success, the way he'd suggest I was working too much whenever I was excited about a new client. I'd written those things off as normal relationship stuff, but sitting in that office, I realized they were signs of something darker. The therapist helped me understand patterns I needed to recognize so I wouldn't fall into them again. We scheduled weekly sessions. Morgan texted me out of nowhere on a Wednesday night. The message was brief. Luke was in therapy too, apparently working through what he'd done. Luke had asked Morgan to tell me he was sorry. Morgan refused to be a messenger. He told Luke that if he wanted to apologize, he needed to figure out how to do it himself. But Morgan didn't think I needed to hear from Luke at all. Morgan said Luke needed to live with what he'd done without my forgiveness. I read the message twice and then typed back a simple thank you. I appreciated Morgan's boundaries and his refusal to make me deal with Luke's guilt. Whatever healing Luke needed to do was his own work, not mine. I attended a small business owners networking event the following month at a community center downtown. I almost didn't go because networking events usually felt forced and awkward, but something made me show up. I sat at a table with 5 other entrepreneurs, people running everything from a graphic design business to a dog walking service. We went around sharing our stories, and when it was my turn, I gave the short version about starting my catering company and facing some setbacks but rebuilding. One woman, who ran a bakery, said she'd lost her storefront to a fire 2 years ago and had to start over from her home kitchen. Another guy said his business partner had embezzled money and nearly bankrupted their company. Everyone had a story of failure or betrayal or disaster that they'd survived. Sitting there listening to them, I realized my experience wasn't unique. Every person building something faced obstacles and setbacks. The difference was whether you let those things destroy you or whether you used them to become stronger. I left that event feeling less alone than I had in months. Rachel brought it up during a slow afternoon at the kitchen when we were prepping for a wedding the next day. She asked if I'd ever thought about bringing on a partner now that business was growing so fast. I stopped chopping vegetables and looked at her. She'd been with me through everything, stayed when I had to let everyone go, came back without hesitation when I restarted. She knew my systems, understood my standards, and clients loved her. I told her I'd think about it seriously. Over the next week, we met 3 times to discuss what partnership would look like. Rachel wanted to invest $10,000 for 20% ownership and take on more management responsibilities so I could focus on menu development and client relationships. The numbers made sense, and more importantly, I trusted her completely. We shook hands on it and scheduled a meeting with my lawyer to draw up the papers. Jerome called me on a Thursday afternoon and invited me to a family barbecue that weekend. He said there was someone he wanted me to meet. I almost said no because family events with Luke's relatives felt complicated, but something in Jerome's voice made me agree. I showed up Saturday afternoon with a tray of appetizers I'd made that morning. Jerome's backyard was full of people, and he immediately guided me toward an older woman sitting in a lawn chair. He introduced her as his brother's widow, Luke's mother. She stood up when she saw me, and before I could say anything, she pulled me into a tight hug. She was crying, apologizing for her son, thanking me for not pressing criminal charges when I could have. I stood there awkwardly patting her back while she sobbed into my shoulder. When she finally pulled away, she kept holding my hands and looking at me with this expression of deep sadness mixed with gratitude. She told me that Luke's father would have made him face real consequences for what he did. She said her husband believed in accountability and would have been ashamed of the man Luke became. She kept saying she wished she'd raised him better, that she must have failed somewhere along the way. I squeezed her hands and told her Luke made his own choices. He was an adult who decided to sabotage someone he claimed to love, and that wasn't on her. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't fully believe me. We sat together for a while, and she told me stories about Luke's father and the Mustang, how they'd worked on it together every weekend for 2 years. I listened and realized she'd lost her husband, and now had to accept what her son had become. Before I left, she hugged me again and made me promise to stay in touch with Jerome. The partnership papers were ready 2 weeks later. Rachel and I met at the lawyer's office on a Monday morning and signed everything. She wrote me a check for $10,000, and I signed over 20% of the business I'd built from nothing. We celebrated that night by catering a charity event for free, feeding 100 people at a homeless shelter downtown. Rachel worked beside me the whole time, and it felt right having her as an actual partner instead of just an employee. We served chicken parmesan and roasted vegetables and homemade rolls, and people came back for seconds and thirds. One woman told us it was the best meal she'd had in months. Driving home that night, I realized I wasn't alone in this anymore. I had someone who believed in what I was building as much as I did. Delilah called me the next week with a proposal. She wanted me to be the exclusive caterer for her wedding planning business. She'd been watching my comeback, seen how I handled the Henderson sisters' wedding, and decided she only wanted to work with vendors she could trust completely. The contract would guarantee steady high-end work, probably 20 to 30 events a year, but it meant I couldn't take other wedding jobs that conflicted with her schedule. Rachel and I talked it through, ran the numbers, and negotiated terms that worked for both businesses. We signed a year-long contract that would bring in consistent income and connect us with Delilah's wealthy clients. It felt like another piece of stability clicking into place. I met someone at the next business networking event. He ran a small marketing firm, and we ended up talking for an hour about the challenges of building something from scratch. He asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime, and I said yes before I could overthink it. The date happened on a Wednesday evening at a cafe downtown. I felt nervous the whole drive there, wondering if I could trust someone new after everything with Luke. But therapy had taught me what red flags to watch for, and this guy seemed different. He asked about my business but didn't try to give me advice or get involved. He talked about his own work but didn't dominate the conversation. When I mentioned I had an early morning prep the next day, he immediately suggested we wrap up so I could get rest. It was such a small thing, but it mattered. We started seeing each other casually after that. Nothing serious, just dinner once a week or a movie on Sunday afternoons. He was supportive of my business without trying to be part of it, which felt completely different from Luke's suffocating interest. He never showed up at the kitchen unannounced, never asked to help with events, never made me feel guilty for working weekends. When I told him I had a big wedding coming up, he just said good luck and asked if I wanted to celebrate after. That was it. No drama, no jealousy, just simple support. My business hit its 3rd anniversary in November. Rachel and I threw a small party at the commercial kitchen for employees, regular clients, and people who'd helped me rebuild. Delilah came and Jerome and Stuart, who'd given me that first space when I was starting over. We served samples from our most popular menus, and I gave a short speech thanking everyone who'd stood by me. I talked about losing everything and having to rebuild, about the people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Rachel stood beside me the whole time, and when I finished talking, everyone clapped. It wasn't a big fancy event, just 20 people in a commercial kitchen eating good food, but it meant everything. A letter arrived at my apartment the following week from Luke's therapist. The letter explained that Luke was working through his actions, and part of his recovery involved making amends. The therapist asked if I'd be willing to participate in a session to help Luke process what he'd done. I read the letter twice, then called my own therapist. She listened to me read it out loud, and then asked how I felt about it. I told her I didn't want to help Luke feel better about destroying my business. She agreed that I didn't owe Luke anything, including participation in his healing. I wrote a polite response declining the invitation, and mailed it back the same day. Whatever Luke needed to do to move forward was his responsibility, not mine. Rachel and I started looking at larger commercial spaces in December. The kitchen we were renting worked fine, but we were booking so many events that we needed more room for equipment and staff. We found a space across town with double the square footage, better parking, and room to expand. The lease was more expensive, but our numbers supported it. We signed the papers right before Christmas, planning to move in January. Rachel wanted to add meal prep services and cooking classes to bring in income during slower months. We spent hours planning the layout, figuring out where to put the new ovens and refrigerators, designing a small classroom space for the cooking classes. It felt like we were building something that could last, something bigger than just catering events. Standing in that empty space with Rachel, I realized I'd come further than I ever thought possible after Luke destroyed everything. I'd rebuilt not just my business, but my whole life, and this time it was stronger. The new kitchen opened in February, and within a week we were running cooking classes on weekday evenings and meal prep services on weekends between catering events. Rachel handled most of the class instruction while I focused on the catering side, and we hired 2 more part-time employees to help with prep and delivery. The business felt solid in a way it never had before, built on actual systems instead of just me working myself to exhaustion. I was leaving the new space late one Thursday after teaching a knife skills class when I saw Morgan sitting at a table in the restaurant next door. He waved me over before I could decide whether to pretend I hadn't seen him. I sat down across from him, and he told me Luke moved to Denver 3 months ago, got a job at a tech startup doing database management. Morgan said Luke was seeing a therapist twice a week and seemed to be working on himself, trying to understand why he did what he did. I listened and realized I didn't feel the anger that used to burn in my chest when anyone mentioned Luke's name. I just felt tired and relieved that it was over, that he was somewhere else living his life, and I was here living mine. Morgan asked if I was doing okay, and I told him the business was better than ever, that I'd moved on completely. He seemed relieved to hear it, like he'd been carrying guilt about what his friend did. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, then I went home to my apartment and slept better than I had in months. My relationship with the guy from the networking group turned into something steady over the next few months. He owned a small accounting firm and understood the demands of running a business without trying to be involved in mine. We had dinner twice a week, went hiking on Sundays when I wasn't working, and he never once made me feel guilty about checking my phone during event season. Rachel met him at a staff barbecue in April and pulled me aside after to say she approved, that he seemed like someone who actually supported me instead of just saying he did. Celia met him the following week and said the same thing. My employees liked him because he'd show up to help load equipment without being asked, then disappear when the actual work started so we could focus. He met Jerome at a car show in May, and they talked about classic cars for an hour while I handled a consultation call. Everything about it felt easy and healthy in a way my relationship with Luke never had, even in the beginning when I thought things were good. The corporate gala booking came through in June from a tech company celebrating their 10th anniversary. 300 guests, full dinner service with past appetizers and a dessert bar, $25,000 contract. It was bigger than the Henderson wedding had been, the kind of event that could make or break a catering company's reputation. I spent 2 weeks planning every detail with Rachel, creating backup plans for the backup plans, testing every recipe 3 times to make sure it was perfect. We rented additional equipment, hired temporary staff for the event, and did a full dress rehearsal the week before with our regular employees. The day of the gala, I arrived at the venue 6 hours early to set up, and everything went exactly according to plan. The appetizers came out hot and perfectly timed, the main course service flowed smoothly, and the dessert bar looked like something from a magazine spread. The company's CEO found me during cleanup and told me it was the best event food his employees had ever experienced, then asked if we could cater their quarterly events for the next year. I signed the contract the following week, guaranteeing steady high-end work and reliable income for the foreseeable future. Standing in the new kitchen after that conversation, looking at the equipment we'd bought and the team we'd built, I realized I hadn't just rebuilt what Luke destroyed. I'd created something better and stronger than before, something that was entirely mine and couldn't be taken away. The business that started with $5,000 and a dream was now generating 6 figures annually with a full staff and a waiting list of clients. Luke had tried to destroy me, but all he'd done was force me to rebuild myself into someone who couldn't be destroyed. So yeah, that's the whole thing. Nothing groundbreaking, just a story that stuck with me. Thanks for hanging out. It always feels like we're just catching up.